What I want to do is talk a little bit about some ideas that are coming out of a book we also published this year, a book on degrowth. The book, as you see in the book cover, it features a garden. And indeed, as some commentator in a panel I attended in a geography conference pointed to me, the book itself is a garden of interwoven ideas. It would be false, we decided, the editors of the book, to present degrowth as a cohesive theory and practice. This is what you heard also from Dan. No, there's not a clear pinpointing definition of degrowth. This is why we chose to present this new theory in the format of a vocabulary. We invited the readers to wander through interconnected keywords. Each chapter of the book is a small keyword, is a keyword of 1,000 words, and make their own sense by reading these keywords of what degrowth is all about. Today, however, I want to do something slightly different. I want to advance the cohesion of the theory of degrowth. So I don't want to open up and show the plurality, but get a little bit more specific of what is coming out of this work. For sure, there is no axiomatic economic theory of degrowth, and there shouldn't be one. That's not the goal. My approach today will be different. I will look retrospectively at our book and the literature on degrowth, and I will decipher the particular view of the economy that comes out of it. So I'll try to understand what is the economics of degrowth by looking at what we have published. That's a strange approach, no? We don't know what's the view of economy and then we publish it, but we publish and then we see, okay, what did we just do? This is a view of the economy, I will argue, that is more complex than that of the standard ecological economics model. And this is the textbook ecological economics model graph. In this model, the economy is a sphere of allocation and distribution, the blue box, limited by an ecosystem that provides it with resources and absorbs its wastes. Degrowth in this model could be simply conceived as a shrinking of the blue box so that it stays within the limits of the green circle. In the degrowth literature instead, I will argue that the economy is understood first as an invention, second, that is political, third, diverse, and fourth, material. And the key question I will show is not scarcity, but surplus. This presentation is going to be theoretical. So I ask for your patience and for your, let's say, for engaging with it while it's not going to be as engaging perhaps as Dan's was. I hope, though, that it won't be abstract or esoteric. I'm addressing here mostly ecological economists, but I hope it's not going to be esoteric for the wider public that it's here. And to convince you of its practical relevance, I will show at the end of the presentation how this theory, these 5 lines of understanding the economy, helps us rethink growth and the alternatives to it. So let me start. First, the economy is an invention. This might sound too constructivist. It is not. It is a historical fact, argues Serge Latouche. And he asks, when and how did we come to think of an autonomous system out there called the economy? According to Timothy Mitchell, quite recently, before the 1940s, economy meant to economize, to allocate things in an efficient manner. The notion of a national economy was born amidst planning for war production and controlling the monetary supply to avoid crisis. This was part and parcel of new tools of representation and measuring, such as national accounts and the GDP. New institutions, the ministries of national economy, most of them were founded after the Second World War, which were founded precisely to govern this new system that was conceived as being the economy. This invention took place in a period of unlimited cheap oil, and GDP imagined an economy of pure exchange value. Unlike an economy of physical quantities, the GDP economy is from its conception one that in theory at least, can grow indefinitely. I'm not saying here that invented abstractions are any less real. I'm not arguing that this is an invention, hence it is wrong. However imperfect, abstractions may represent things and processes that correspond to actual experiences. And fantasies become real if we act on the basis of such fantasies. Think of wars in the name of gods. The God may be a fantasy, we will agree here, but your dead body after the war is as real as it gets. Or think of the lives of people sacrificed by austerity policies in the name of pushing GDP a few points up. Our ecological economy, too, is a reinvention, one of an economy limited by ecosystems. It may be a better abstraction, but an imperfect abstraction it also is. And the fate of our invention, and this is the point I want to register here, does not depend only on how well it models reality. It depends also on whether it will mold institutions and reality to its own image. In a world with carbon caps, the ecological economics model will be a better representation of the economy. In a world with ministries of ecological economy rather than national economy, measuring the genuine progress index, again, ecological economics model will be a better representation of the economy. Second, I want to argue that the economy is political. In the degrowth literature, I'm always talking. It is not an independent system governed by the laws of supply and demand. The imaginary free market does not exist, Karl Polanyi long ago argued. The free market is constantly constructed through state intervention and enforcement. Think of the complex institutions necessary for counting or trading ecosystem services. Or think of the so-called liberation of central banks from political control. This required very strong political intervention, and it had very strong distributive implications, as we experience today. In ecological economics, we do recognize the political nature of the economy when we argue that efficient allocation depends on the initial distribution of property rights, a distribution that we all agree is political. Often, though, we reproduce an economistic distinction between an economy out there with its own laws and processes, and the benevolent planner up there supposed to listen to our diagnosis and maximize the collective good. We always address some policy proposals to some imagined benevolent planner who will implement them. I argue that we need to move as ecological economics to a Polanyian mode of analysis where the political and its change become part of our research. It's not what we are addressing, it is what we are studying. We need, for example, to shift from developing methods of valuing nature to understanding the political economy of commodification. Third point, the economy is diverse, as feminist economists Gibson Graham argue. Its visible part is the capitalist economy of private property, wage labor, market exchange, and profit-seeking firms. But below the surface, there is a wealth of alternatives. Alternative work, paid labor. Alternative firms, such as cooperatives or non-capitalist associations, like social centers. Alternative markets, such as fair trade, or non-market exchanges, such as barters, gifts, and donations. Free help and mutual care between friends or family members. If we see only the capitalist economy, Gibson Graham argue, that is the top of the iceberg, then we just reify and help to reproduce it. Commodification brings relations from the bottom of the iceberg to the top. Ecosystem services, gifts such as hospitality or domestic care work are assigned a price tag incorporated into the GDP economy. Polanyi talked of fictitious commodities, not only ecosystem services and land, but also labor and money. These are not produced to be commodities. That's the definition. Treating the work performed by different humans as comparable and commensurable was as awkward a fiction when it first appeared, with the beginning of capitalism, as it is to treat ecosystems the same way today. Historically, though, capitalism has subsisted and expanded by bringing new relations under its realm. But in moments of crisis, Polanyi argued, society struggles back against its treatment as a mere commodity. Communism and fascism, he argued in the 1940s, were two such very different social counter-movements. So are today, I would add, the occupied squares, the alternative solidarity economies, the anti-austerity political parties, but also the rising xenophobic nationalists. Fourth, the economy is material and biophysical. Human hands and heads do not work alone. They use energy and raw materials, and they produce wastes. This metabolic view will not be news for ecological economists, and I don't have much to add here. I do take issue, though, with our representation as ecological economists of the economy and by extension of society as ultimately limited by an external ecosystem. This is like the green thing within which society is, within which economy is. Let me argue carefully why I think this is wrong before anyone rushes to think that I became a techno-optimist since the last conference of Degrowth, no? Which is a short period. We often invoke Giorgos Kallis entropy law, but we know well that given solar energy and recycling, it is questionable whether there is an ultimate limit for activity on planet Earth. Even if there is, it is billion years from now and cannot reasonably concern us right now. What I keep from Giorgos Kallis instead, yes, thanks, is that the production of order in some places and times shifts disorder or entropy elsewhere. Any techno-fix, such as nuclear power, which increases the throughput of energy, will accelerate entropy somewhere, sooner or later. But the entropy law alone does not tell us that we face some irrevocable limits. The discussion about limits boils down to specifics, not to laws. And we as ecological economists are engaged in pointing these limits. But there, of course, opinions differ. Maybe we are running out of oil, maybe not, as we access unconventional fossil fuels, shale oil discoveries. Maybe phosphorus is running out, or maybe substitutes are in order. Climate change may be a biting limit, but its effects on the economy are difficult to quantify. And limits to what, I would argue? Limits to growth, someone would answer. But why should we ecological economists, for example, who want to do away with a growth fetish, care so much whether growth is coming to an end or not? Even if growth comes to an end, even if oil ends or the climate collapses, human activity will continue at a different order of magnitude with different qualities and in geographically variegated forms. The important question in this context is precisely what forms of human activity can continue, for whom, where, and under what conditions. Here, I find much more useful another ecological economic model, Richard Norgaard's model of coevolution. Unlike the view of nature as a reservoir that is close to running out, coevolution suggests that we constantly mold our environments, and we are constantly molded by our molded environments. Human activity constantly transforms ecosystems and then adapts, for good or for bad, to its transformations. This doesn't mean that any adaptation or any outcome is good. Don't mistake me here. Like beavers building dams, we humans are co-producers of new natures. But we are extremely powerful producers. The question, therefore, is not whether humanity as a whole will survive a climate or resource disaster or limit, but who will live how and where, with what non-human natures. This is ultimately a question of justice, social and environmental justice, not one of resource technicalities. It is a question of what natures and for whom we want to see produced in the future. I do not discard here the idea of limits, but I see limits, and we see limits in the book, in the introduction to the book, as the object of political choice, not as something out there imposed upon us, not as some green thing out there that it's causing limits to us. We want to limit our production and consumption so as to pass a better and more egalitarian environment to our kids. I don't have kids yet, but I imagine that when I have, I would like to pass an egalitarian future to them. Not because we are running out of things, though. In the face of uncertainty, I personally side with peak oil, peak phosphorus, impossibility of dematerialization, the impossible arithmetic of climate change, etc. And I do work to prove that this is the case. But this says as much about my desires for limits as about the facts. Limits, or better, how am I doing of time?
You have 16 minutes.
16 minutes, okay, I'm doing well then. Limits, or better, self-limitation, should be distinguished from scarcity. So I want to separate these two concepts. Scarcity, I argue, is a very problematic concept, but also one that is foundational for economics. To move beyond growth, ecological economics should also move beyond scarcity. The concept of scarcity, Nicholas Xenos shows in his book, appeared precisely at the time that capitalism was creating a material abundance never seen before. And he argues this is no coincidence. Scarcity and capitalism went hand in hand. Capitalism produces scarcity by enclosing the commons and by fueling positional inequalities. I have a lot, I have less than someone else, so I feel I'm constantly in a state of scarcity. But capitalism also promises to resolve scarcity by developing the means of production, the rising of all boats constantly. Economics, interestingly, declared as its mission from the beginning the study of scarcity. A scarcity, which, if you know a little bit of the basic of economic theory, is by definition perpetual. As for economics, for mainstream economics, needs are assumed to be unlimited. So if you have infinite needs, of course, scarcity is always there. There will always be scarcity. Permanent scarcity, different from temporal shortages or population overshoots that do take place, is an invention of capitalism. Other civilizations before did not know of scarcity. They did not even have a word for it. Scarcity is a function of aspirations, not natural conditions. The Sahara Desert was not scarce for the Berbers. Marshall Salins showed this, an anthropologist, that there was no scarcity in the Stone Age, he argued. He said this was the original affluent society, because before the affluent society of the 1950s and 60s. He said this was not the case because resources were abundant in the Stone Age, but because people found ways to live with enough. Self-limitation and sharing is what dissolved scarcity. The vision of a limited world with which our needs choke, the green thing with which the blue thing chokes, is at the heart of modern economics. It is the raison d'etre of capitalism and growth. Sorry for my bad French accent for the French people here. And I think it's a conception that we must do away with it. So I turn to my fifth point, which is the one of the epilogue of the Degrowth book. This is the idea that the key problem is excess, not scarcity. We borrow this idea from French philosopher Georges Bataille via the contribution of Onofrio Romano in our book. He has a chapter precisely on this theory of dépense, of expending the surplus. All societies have a surplus. Even the Berbers in the desert have their occasional crazy feasts every now and then. All societies, I will argue, produce more than what is necessary for their mere reproduction. Such absolute surplus should be distinguished from relative or social surplus that we are more familiar with. The latter refers to the excess of work and services provided by wage or domestic labor without compensation. It's the Marxist sense of surplus. We could argue as ecological economists that there is also a surplus or a subsidy produced by using active or fossilized ecosystems without replenishing them. The core question of political economy and ecological economics is, in fact, the distribution of this surplus. But in addition to distribution, an equally important question, we argue, is the expenditure of surplus. Stone Age societies let it be. They just let the surplus be. The Egyptians used it to build pyramids, and the medievals used it to decorate churches and palaces. The Tibetans instead devoted it to idleness and spirituality, supporting a huge class of monks. The use of surplus, we argue, gives to each society its essence and its purpose. The key innovation of capitalist civilization was precisely that it invested surplus into further production, creating even more surplus and reinvesting it again. This was precisely the source of the growth takeoff. This is why growth appears with capitalist civilization. Growth is the essence of capitalism, and it's precisely its essence because this is what this society is doing with its surplus. Surplus, however, has to be constantly dissipated. When it overaccumulates, when we have too much surplus, its dissipation can be destructive. Bataille says, think of a war or a devaluation. We have too much money, we don't know what to do with it. It has to be destroyed. It becomes catastrophic, too much surplus. And I will argue that the key insight of Keynes was precisely this, that to become stable, I don't have a slide for Keynes, but people can imagine a guy with a pipe, etc. also. A capitalist economy, he argued, to become stable, needs to plan non-destructive outlets for its surplus. This was precisely the idea of stimulating demand, have something to absorb and consume and use this surplus. The generalization and the privatization of consumption, the creation of new artificial needs, this is precisely what stabilized capitalism after the Great Depression and the Second World War. Dépense, the expenditure or dissipation of surplus, was privatized. Each of us could have their binging parties, their swimming pools, the summer holidays. All of these things that we do, our consumption, are non-productive expenditures. It's things that the system needs in order to be stable. Consumerism then, together with growth, became the pleasure and the meaning of capitalism. One might, of course, say that this surplus is not real. I'm often told by friends that without fossil fuels, we will face lack, not excess. But lack to do what? There are currently so many artificial needs, or so many bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called them. These are all ways of dissipating the bonanza of an oil surplus. It is not unthinkable, at least in principle, that renewables could satisfy the basic reproduction needs of everyone and leave a surplus. The standard ecological economic idea, though, that we can determine an optimal scale and consume exactly that and nothing more, I think is a little bit too technocratic. Even before the advent of fossil fuels, societies wasted exorbitant surpluses, even poor societies. Think of the Chinese Great Wall, or think of the pyramids, or think of the golden palaces of sultans and maharajas. This was before oil and before growth. An exorbitant exhibition of the excess of its society. Oops, I left that. Yes, so this is from the conclusion of our book, and this is the book of Bataille that I was referring to. So let me use these ideas to quickly wrap it up by rethinking growth and the alternatives to it. So as ecological economists, we have engaged with the materiality of the economy, the fourth of the 5 components. We have shown how energy and resources influence or limit economic growth, and why a dematerialized economy is much more difficult in practice than it is in theory. We have also documented the impacts of growth, especially in the world's commodity frontiers, as registered by the Atlas, the Environmental Justice Atlas prepared by my colleagues in Barcelona. But I argue we should also understand growth as a recent invention and work to trace its origins. Growth is not a transhistorical objective. Economists perpetuate the myth of a Malthusian trap, the 2,000 years of stagnation before the miracle of capitalism appeared. This was a trap that all civilizations, according to this narrative, tried to escape, but only ours managed to do so. Growth is indeed what capitalist civilization produced. To other civilizations, it hadn't ever occurred to pursue growth, though. It's not that they were trying and they couldn't do it. It's that this was not the mentality. This was not where surplus was going. GDP counted and reified what the capitalist system was already producing. And that's a switch of thinking. Growth was already taking place. It's not that we said, oh, we need to grow, you know. This is what was taking place. And then we started naming it and measuring it. It turned an outcome into an ideology. Escaping growth, therefore, requires reinventing, recounting, and re-representing the economy, or doing away with it altogether, but at some point. I don't think it's the time yet. Second, growth and neoclassical economics are not dominant because they won a noble battle of ideas and facts. Political force molded the world in the image of these ideas. These are powerful ideas, but not because they are truer or true. They have to be treated as true because they are powerful. Ignore, for example, capital or debit markets at your own peril. You cannot do that because that's how the system works. But it's not because like this description is somehow a truer description of some real thing called the economy. Implementing carbon caps or reducing working hours is first and foremost a question of political struggle and political transformation. Ecological economics has to go beyond addressing non-existent benevolent planners. If there are a few left of them, let's address them. But instead engage with the analysis of real-world politics and with transformative action research. I'm not saying that we are not doing that, but I think we should do more of that. Third, I will argue, growth is part and parcel of commodification. Growth involves counting what previously was left uncounted or provided for free. Yet this is a self-contradictory process. Commodifying what was a free subsidy, be it women's work or ecosystem services, pushes accounts up, but only for a while. In the long term, it acts as a tax on growth, because it was a free subsidy before. So that's a contradiction of capitalism. As Polanyi noted, the commodification of fictitious commodities undermines their very provision. In times of crisis, societies strike back and attempt to take back and decommodify the economy. Consider the proliferation of commons, of urban gardens, time banks, community currencies, and the like, in the countries that they were worst hit by the crisis. A new economy is reinvented in these cases, but from the ground up. Our job, I think, as ecological economists, is to provide the concepts, the models, that will help this type of economy instead to flourish. Finally, growth is fundamentally, as I argued, a process of yielding surplus and reinvesting it for further growth. Degrowth would have to reverse this dynamic without undermining those social well-being, the dilemma that Tim Jackson pointed and Dan put in the slide. This might involve being intentionally unproductive in some sectors, notably health, education, or the arts. This is what Tim Jackson proposes, becoming some new kind of Tibetans and letting things idle, or some people idle, being less productive than they could potentially be. Leaving resources and human and natural resources idle and taking them out of the accumulation circuit. Work sharing, basing and ceiling income, carbon taxes or carbon caps are all institutions that in essence what they do is redistribute surplus in an economy that would no longer grow. And yet, and this is how I will conclude, a post-growth civilization would also have to rethink how to expend its surplus, however small that surplus or smaller that surplus may be, and expend it in line with a new essence and a new purpose. We closed our book on degrowth, with which I started, with what some commentators called a Mediterranean optimism. So it came because the three editors happen to be from the Mediterranean. I'm from Greece, and my two co-editors are from Italy, one of them from the very south of Italy, which makes him very Mediterranean.
Thank you.
So we said degrowth does not have to be imagined as hardship. It has to be desired, otherwise it will never come. And we imagined, in the concluding chapter of our book, of a festive society of frugal subjects where surplus is wasted in collective feasts. Let me close then this talk with a summary image of a feast from a Greek island against the much harsher reality that's taking place in Greece. Let's say that this is the image of what we would like to see in the future. Thank you.